Let's talk about clay. That's really intense. Okay. We're going to talk about clay. And there's a couple things that you want to consider when you're choosing a clay that you're going to be working with. Here at the Academy of Fine Art Germany, we are using a white water-based clay. This clay doesn't have much by way of grog. And if you take a look at the clay here, you can see a little bit of sandy pieces. These little particles are grog, and this is something that is important more for ceramic artists. However, this grog will affect the surface of your sculpture. If there's a lot of grog, it can cause a lot of texture in the clay, which can be quite nice, or it can be quite frustrating to work with if you're trying to create a very smooth surface. When we're working with the clay, usually we want to keep it rather soft when we're first working with the form. The more plastic it is, the faster and easier it can be to move and change the form. To test the consistency of your clay, you can rest your finger lightly on the surface. If your fingerprint appears, then it's soft. If you press on it slightly and your finger leaves an indentation, then it is quite soft. You want to take into consideration how soft the clay is, because this will affect how you are approaching your sculpting, what tools you are choosing to use, and you have to take into consideration the shrinkage of the clay as well. Every type of clay has a different level of shrinkage. If you allow your clay to dry for too long, then it has the potential to shrink substantially. When you're working on the blocking of your sculpture, it can be useful to work with the clay when it's about like bag consistency. When it's fresh out of the bag, it's usually quite soft, quite elastic and easy to move around. As you get closer to the surface of your sculpture, it can be easier to refine the textures if you allow the surface of your sculpture to dry slightly. This allows you access to work with sandpaper or to work with rakes. When you're working on your sculpture, to check if the clay is soft enough, you can press your finger on the surface of the clay. If it leaves a slight indentation, then you know that it's soft enough. In this case, this clay has become quite hard, and even if I press very firmly on the clay, no impression or indentation is made. In this case, because this particular sculpture is quite dry and it's also comparatively smooth, if we spray the water on it to rehydrate it, unfortunately the water will run right off the sculpture. In this case, you have a few options. In order to rehydrate a sculpture while you're working on it, it helps to add a texture to the sculpture so that the water has something to hold on to. So I normally recommend to use a smaller or a fine rake tool, and you can just create a texture over the surface of your sculpture. If you texture it lightly, this does not necessarily have to affect the form of your sculpture, and will only be adding a light texture. This texture helps to hold the water in place. Oh yeah, fun tips. Okay, if your clay is quite dry, before you put it away at the end of the day, you can wet a towel to keep a towel inside the bag before you cover the clay. This will help so that the clay has time to slowly rehydrate. That we probably shouldn't have in the video. Don't do that. Actually, maybe we should here. If you get too much water on your sculpture, try to take it off. You don't want to create puddles in your sculpture. When you're trying to rehydrate a sculpture with a cloth, underneath the plastic, you want to make sure that the cloth is quite wet. You don't want it to be like sopping wet. but you definitely want it to be dripping a bit. If it's too dry, then instead of adding water to the clay, it will just be sucking the water out of the clay. We're going to talk a little bit about how to take care of water-based clay, because when you're sculpting in a water-based clay, you have to care for it. It's like a living thing, like almost like a plant. You have to babysit it. This sculpture at the moment is quite dry, and this can be useful for working on the surface texture. However, as I'm trying to preserve this sculpture for later this year, I wanted to stay hydrated. So before I put it away, I would definitely cover it with a wet cloth before wrapping it very well. So when you're preparing to put your sculpture away, you want to make sure that you mist it. You want to avoid puddling in your sculpture, as puddled water will turn the clay basically to mud, and oftentimes in the case of, for example, a portrait, the ears would fall off, or potentially a nose. Or if you're particularly unlucky, the whole face. No, that doesn't normally. It can happen, but not normally. When you place the plastic on your sculpture, you want to press the plastic to the surface of your sculpture to avoid as much air as possible. If you're going to leave your sculpture for an extended period of time, you can definitely just make sure to wrap it very, very well, maybe double wrap it with plastic. And it can survive for quite a long time. And we have to talk about mold. Let's talk about mold. So when you're working with water-based clay, there's a few things to consider. You have to take care of the clay. You have to consider how moist it is and how much it needs to be rehydrated, or if you need to allow it some time to dry. You also have to consider your armature and the temperatures in your space, as mold can potentially occur. If you have a moldy sculpture, there's a couple ways to address it. You generally want to make sure in advance, before creating your sculpture, that your armatures are well prepared. You do not want to leave exposed wood unless it has been a wood treated for the elements. If it's untreated, you definitely want to coat it in an oil or typically in a water-resistant paint. If the mold does occur on your sculpture, if there's just a little bit of mold, you can typically spray it with some vinegar and the mold will disappear within a few days. If there is a substantial amount of mold on your armature or on the clay itself, you may want to use a rag or a brush to help remove the excess mold to clean it off. I recommend using a white vinegar to safely remove the mold. Hello, welcome to...
Sculpture.
Oh yeah, welcome to sculpture. Okay.
That could be your thing.
That is my thing. Welcome to sculpture. Okay.